I recently struck a partnership with Ampos Audio. They have agreed to loan me their gear from time to time, and in exchange I will leave purchase links to their website. If you use those links, I'll get a small kickback. I have purchased from Ampos Audio before and believe their customer service is excellent, shipping speed is quick, and my total experience with them has always been professional. Ampos sent me the Dan Clark Aeon 2 Closed to review. This is a $900 planar magnetic headphone. It has a unique style, is handmade in the United States, and comes from a fairly small audio company. Does the Aeon 2 offer anything of relevance, especially for its eye-popping price tag? I have the Ether C Closed, the Ether 2, and previously owned the Aeon Flow Closed. I am therefore quite familiar with Dan Clark's build quality. The Aeon 2 looks quite odd. There is no escaping the fact that you cannot mistake the Aeon for any other headphone on the market. Love it or hate it, the Aeon is a striking image. Dan Clark says this headphone is made from a combination of titanium, aluminum, and carbon, and not the fake carbon coating we're all familiar with. Titanium is an excellent metal. It is light, yet its molecular bond is very strong. Hey, fun factoid, the Lockheed Martin SR-71 Blackbird was made primarily using titanium. Anyway, it is clear that although titanium likely helped inflate the Aeon's price tag, there is a tangible benefit. The headphone is quite light. As I look around from the ear cups to the yoke to the headband to the ear pads to the mini XLR jacks, everything is finely machined, smooth, and above all, seems sturdy. Dan Clark seems proud of its hinged, folding design. I can see why. It is unique. The hinge is strong, which means that your headphones won't accidentally fold in or out. You have to apply considerable pressure to operate the mechanism, and I think that's okay. However, I don't think that the mechanism is particularly great. You see, it is far too easy to push one ear cup in or out of the folded position while the other ear cup does not move. This is not frustrating or any real problem, but does mean you will have to apply force on the outside of the ear cups to squeeze them together, then push the ear cups in or out. The use of mini XLR is consistent with all of the other Dan Clark headphones. I cannot say it is a good idea, however. These cables are not easy to find if you feel like you need to replace them. They are more expensive than 2.5 or 3.5mm options. I think this was an unnecessary complication to the headphone. I've also been flummoxed using the cable. I cannot see any markings on the headphones or the XLR jack on the cable to help line up the insertion point. Consequently, more often than not, I'm left turning the jack, gently pressing down and hoping that I can seat the pins in the correct spots. A few dots on the headphones and the cable would have solved this problem. Indeed, this is the exact method that Dan Clark recommends in the manual. I think it's pretty stupid. Just put an indication so that we don't have to keep turning the darn cable. We should turn, however, to the issue of comfort. Dan Clark says that they improved the comfort of the Aeon 2 over the original Aeon. I had my original Aeon for about 6 months and then sold it. I recall the clamping force being too hard, causing too much pressure. Obviously, I cannot compare the original to the new version, but I can say that the Aeon 2 is fairly comfortable. The clamping force does not feel harsh, but it is still pretty strong. If there was a way for me to turn a knob and loosen the tension, I turn that knob about half a turn. So, the clamping isn't anything like the One More Triple Driver or the DT1770, but neither is this a feather-like seal. One thing you have to give Dan Clark credit for is their earpad design. The ear openings are actually shaped like a human ear. This means that no matter what your ear shape happens to be, chances are that the ear cups will sit around them. The ear pads will very likely engulf your ears. The ear pads feel soft enough, but I have used much softer ear pads. These are synthetic leather. I do not know what type of padding is in there, memory foam or regular foam or just a sponge. The ear pads do not feel like there is actual memory foam because of the springiness of the ear pads. Overall, build and comfort are somewhat unequal in proportion to each other. Build is excellent, but for that minor issue of the folding mechanism. Comfort is probably above average and is certainly nothing as exceptional as Dan Clark pretends. The use of synthetic leather in a $900 headphone seems way out of touch. The clamping force is not going to be perfect for everyone. The ear pads probably could be softer to counter the clamping force. Dan Clark claims that these headphones are comfortable enough to sleep in, but I think that's an exaggeration of laughable proportions. Dan Clark says that the Aeon 2 uses completely new drivers from the original Aeon. They say that the new version increases resolution and dynamics. Truth be told, Dan Clark is fairly vague about the sound signature of the Aeon 2. They compare this headphone with the prior generation. They say that the Aeon 2 has increased bass response, more detail, greater soundstage, and greater treble extension than the original version. The website shows a frequency response graph of the open-back version of the Aeon 2, which is not particularly helpful for the closed-back, but assuming that Dan Clark tried to keep the tuning between these versions fairly close, then you should expect a fairly natural, neutral bass, slightly recessed mids, and an elevated treble. I generally recall my taste for the original Aeon closed. I thought it sounded claustrophobic, lacked detail, had rather anemic bass, and muddy sound signature throughout. I rarely use that headphone because of this less than favorable sound signature. Dan Clark seems to have recognized improvements needed to be made. Finally, Dan Clark includes 2 felt pads in the box. If you insert these pads, you should hear sound alterations. This is nothing groundbreaking. In fact, you can do the same thing to any headphone. In my experience, these felt pads tend to muffle the sound more often than not. For this test, I decided to pair the Aeon 2 with my Sauvage D5 amp DAC. This is a neutral DAC with plenty of power to drive the Aeon 2. I played music over Amazon Music HD. Before I began my typical testing, I listened to the headphones on random songs I had not heard before. I did this to slowly acclimate to the Aeon 2 as I had been listening to various other headphones over the last several days. I did this informal listening for about an hour. I will point out that Dan Clark says we should allow these headphones 50 to 100 hours for burn-in. Burn-in might be beneficial for some headphones. Some people swear about this technique and others say it did not make any difference. I think it is dependent upon the particular headphones you have and the music you're listening to. If 50 to 100 hours seems excessive, then I'll stress that AudioQuest recommended we give their headphones at least 150 hours of burn-in, and that Bass Audio suggests many weeks of constant use. Complicating the burn-in procedure is your ability to actually recall what the headphones originally sounded like. Unless you have a brand new Aeon 2 being compared to an Aeon 2 that has been burned in for 100 hours, there is absolutely no way to determine if the burn-in process did anything meaningful. Indeed, many factors have equal influence on any perceived alteration of sound due to burn-in. For example, the placement of the headphones on your head, your steady acceptance of the headphone's sound signature over the course of a 100-hour period, and personal expectations, a cognitive bias that is very difficult to overcome, all contribute in some degree. Consequently, since there is no way for me to test the burn-in claim for the Aeon 2, I'm not going to give that suggestion much weight. The following testing results are after a 1-hour period of listening to random music not on my test playlist. I did not use the tuning felt pads. I think that the Aeon 2 is somewhat neutral to bass, but not really there. There is no doubt that bass heads will be disappointed, and there is nothing about the bass response which will make people fall out of their seats. On Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the song has a low rumble from the beginning to the end. There should be a lingering reverberation from that rumble. The Aeon was not able to effectively recreate that rumble. The rumble was audible, but its transience was quite fast, meaning there was little time for the reverberation to carry through. The rumble should have been more prevalent. When the crescendo hits at the middle of the song, the organ cut through the mix without distorting, without overwhelming the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible, but slightly rolled off. Separation of instruments was fairly good. Instead of a jumble of sounds, the Aeon was able to present minor differences in tonality among the various instruments. However, I could not distinguish one instrument from another based upon this particular distinction. When the vocals start around 3 minutes and 10 seconds, they slowly rose from the background but were never able to shine through. Indeed, they remained at least one step behind the other instruments. On Conquer by Overwork, the Aeon was able to recreate the rolling marble effect at the beginning of the song, but it was a little muffled. The left and right panning of that sound was barely audible. Indeed, the sound appeared mostly dead center. Mid-bass impact was accurate and fast, though slightly blunted. It was as if someone had draped a bedsheet in front of the speaker, causing the sound to be less energetic. I could hear the various drums and knew that there were at least 3 different types. However, none of the drums stood out from each other and each had a similar, marginally blunted effect. The synth was accurate and neutral. It did not cause fatigue. I next listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, Uproar, Nupatek, and Reel It In. Yet again, it was obvious that the sub-bass was lacking. The transients was too fast for the minimal sub-bass to be effective. There was some sub-bass and mid-bass melding, and the mid-bass was far more obvious than the sub-bass. The vocals sounded about 2 steps ahead of the mix and had the requisite sparkle. The vocals did not sound harsh or shouty. I could hear minor perturbations in the vocals. For example, when a singer's voice cracked, I could hear it. That type of detail was crisp, though not shoved into my ears. Overall, the bass response is nothing special. In fact, I think although that the bass is serviceable, it is not truly neutral and certainly not elevated. Sub-bass needs more emphasis, and at least by 3 or 4 decibels. Mid-bass I think is close to accurate, though it still needs a bit more energy. Transients is very fast and on par with most planar magnetic headphones. This causes very fast reverberation that is not true to the original recording. Bass instruments tend to lose their full effect because of this. The mid's response is not neutral and the tonality might be a little off-putting to some. Although not harsh or out of timbre, there are some elements that should be considered carefully. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there is natural grain and sibilance recorded into the song. The Aeon marginally elevated the sibilance. I would say that the increase is by a few decibels and not really harsh, though it does get close. The grain is also slightly accentuated. The combination here does not distort or make the vocals unbearable, but it is also not natural or neutral. The drums had fast decay, and this caused them to sound less impactful than they should be. Nevertheless, all instruments had correct timbre. Separation of instruments was about average. All instruments melded, though if I concentrated I could pick out the drum from the guitar. The vocal stood out about 2 steps ahead of the other instruments. When the backup vocalist appears at 2 minutes and 45 seconds, she was clearly audible in the right ear cup, and her tonality remained distinct even when everything else was playing. In Want You Back by Haim, the Aeon again slightly accentuated the sibilance of the primary vocalist. It was not harsh, but also not neutral. At 10 seconds into the song, the primary singer drags out the word "we," making it sound gravelly. The Aeon recreated that detail, but it also sounded a little bit muffled. When the 2 backup vocalists appeared, they had their own individual tonalities, one in the left and the other in the right ear cups. When the entire mix played at maximum, both backup vocalists melded significantly. If I listened very carefully, I could still pick out their individual tonalities. The guitars, piano, and drums had accurate timbre. However, the drums sounded a bit muffled and recessed. The bass guitar was hard to spot inside the mix. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Aeon portrayed the drums and ukulele with accurate timbre. There's a bass guitar at the beginning of the song, but it sounded quite recessed. It should have been more forward in the mix. The male vocalist sounded smooth and accurate. He has natural sibilance in this recording, and the Aeon was able to keep that neutral. The decay, transients of instruments was fast. The drums sounded a little distant, the bass guitar was barely audible in the mix, and all instruments tended to meld. There is a backup vocalist in this song, but he was not audible. There are sharp intakes of breaths between 1 minute and 10 seconds and 1 minute and 20 seconds. The Aeon recreated those details, but they were muffled and not the sharp intakes that they should have been. Overall, the mid's response is consistent among all the test tracks. Instruments tend to meld, though not anywhere close to muddiness. Female vocals have accentuated sibilance, though not quite harsh. Male vocals are smooth and neutral. All instruments have correct timbre. However, because of the fast transients and bass roll-off, vocals seem ahead of every mix. These are not shouty or harsh, however. The treble is kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, many people will be very happy with the performance. On the other hand, many people will be displeased. Oy. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the Aeon let the horns and brass cut through the mix, but there was a lot of melding among instruments. Moreover, the horns and brass seemed rolled off, their energy decreased by several decibels. On the one hand, this provides a softer, less intense sound, but on the other hand, the instrument sounded a little blunted. I could not hear individual instruments, but I did hear group sets. Everything appeared left or right. There was no verticality or depth. I never got the impression that the orchestra was in a semicircle in front of me. The sounds never came from the extremes of the air cups and were always dead center. In Flight from the City by Johan Johansson, the piano sounded like it was about 5 feet away from me. The bassier notes were quite rolled off and had very fast transients. The electric buzz effect was audible but marginally muffled. The cello was smooth and had accurate timbre. It melded with the piano notes. That melding was entirely accurate. However, the piano often overshadowed the cello, which was not accurate. I could hear minor details like the creaking of wood and the shifting of the cello. These details were easily audible, though not pushed forward. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Aeon presented the piano in the right ear cup, the drum kit in the left, and the saxophone dead center. The bass was somewhere in the mix, hardly audible. The impact of the hi-hat and the cymbal was blunted. They sounded more recessed than they should have. The saxophone had marginally more energy than true neutral, but it was not harsh or shouty. All instruments tended to meld, yet had accurate tonality. Overall, the treble response is a bit inconsistent. Horns and brass seemed rolled off, the saxophone seemed slightly pushed forward, separation of instruments was about average, but nothing got harsh or peaky. For orchestral pieces, I think that the Aeon presents a more relaxed, more gentle approach to instruments that might be harsh to some people. I listened to several jazz saxophone tracks, including St. Thomas by Sonny Rollins, Masters of War by Charles Lloyd and the Marvels, and Havana by Samuel Solis. On each track, the saxophone was a bit sharper than neutral, but not shouty or harsh. Use that information as you will. The bottom line is that some instruments sound recessed, while other treble instruments sound forward. Throughout this test, I have tried to highlight the details I can hear, and I will merely summarize in this section. The Aeon is not a detail monster. In fact, it is easily about average in this respect. Details are audible and typically not lost. They are generally a little muffled, however. Some details, like the creaking of wood and shifting of the cello, are rather natural, audible, but not forced upon you. Other details, such as sharp intakes of breath, sound recessed and a little muffled. Any detail that requires a bass instrument is pretty much a lost cause. The bass is so fast and generally recessed or rolled off that such details are lost. Consequently, bass guitars are often hard to perceive. Multiple drums might sound different, but their individual tonalities also do not sound distinct enough to immediately identify them. Other synthetic details like the sound of electric buzzing is audible but slightly recessed or muffled and not accurate to the original recording. Instrument separation is about average as well. There is about natural amount of melding, but it was rare that I heard one instrument absolutely clearly and separate from any other instrument. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of detail, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The king of detail retrieval in this test is the Focal Clear, which presents 18 footsteps. The second best is the Austrian Audio Hi X55, which presents 14 to 15 footsteps. The Aeon 2 presented 6 to 7 footsteps. All of the footsteps were a little muffled. This result was entirely consistent with my listening tests. Details are presented fairly naturally. Minute details are not obvious on the Aeon, and if details matter to you, then I think you should look elsewhere. Dan Clark says that the Aeon 2 has improved Soundstage over the original Aeon. As I said before, I was truly unhappy with the claustrophobic sound of the original. I remember that problem quite clearly. I am happy to say that the Aeon 2 does not sound like that at all. The Aeon 2 has about average soundstage. I would say it's about the same as the LCD-1, the HD6XX, and the 660S, and definitely greater than what we hear on the NDH-20. The Aeon 2 has less soundstage than the Hi-Fi Mansandara. The FR graph I showed from Dan Clark was for the Aeon 2 Open. I know that there are third-party measurements, but I did not want to look at them before I listened to the headphones. Now that I have heard the headphones, I found the measurements posted on Superbest Audio Friends. That graph seems very similar to the open back measurement on Dan Clark's website, and I can say I do not hear what is measured in either graph. You might assume from these measurements that the mids are recessed, that the bass and treble is elevated. Well, the bass is not elevated. It is, in fact, a bit rolled off, if anything. The treble has a slight increase in a very specific frequency range, but there's also a bit of a roll-off in some instruments. Most of all, the mids are not recessed. I cannot tell you how many tracks I've listened to at this point on the Aeon 2, but the vast majority involve vocals, and never once have I felt that the vocals are recessed. Indeed, generally speaking, the vocals tend to be 1 to 2 steps ahead of every single mix. So take the measurements with a hefty grain of salt. Of course, inserting the included filter pads will affect the sound one way or another. I have not done that, and maybe I'll do a video about it. I try to focus on the experience out of the box without any modifications. Now, on to sound signature. I would say that the Aeon 2 is a fairly balanced sounding headphone. Yes, the bass needs more emphasis, and some treble instruments are a little rolled off, but the mids are clear and forward without sounding harsh. There are many balanced headphones on the market. The ones I've heard include the M1060, the 1060C, the 1070, the 1570, and the Sitka Phoenix, just to name a few. All these sound different from one another in various ways, and they sound different from the Aeon 2. This is neither good nor bad, just an acceptable variance. What I can say without hesitation is this. The Aeon 2 never made any instrument, vocalist, or detail harsh. Yes, there are some muffled details, but about the natural amount of details. Keep in mind that I have heard headphones that truly kick details into your face, such as the X55, the HD800S, and the Focal Clear. So when I say that the Aeon 2 has muffled details, that is also in comparison to headphones that are designed to reveal all details. However, in comparison to the Sitka Phoenix, I think that the Phoenix provides clearer details, though not more of them. The M1570 has the same amount of details as the Aeon 2, but also a little bit more crispness and more obviousness to the same details. Yet, if you compare the Aeon 2 to the LCD-1, then you'll notice both are about on par. Indeed, I think I would suggest that the Aeon 2 is actually a little clearer in detail than the LCD-1. So overall, the Aeon 2 is a fairly balanced, natural-sounding headphone. $900 before tax and shipping is a ton of money. In this price range, you've got a lot of options. I mean, there are many planar magnetic headphones that cost half as much as the Aeon 2. My question is, what does the Aeon 2 do better than the cheaper alternatives, both planar and dynamic drivers? And the answer is nothing. There is absolutely nothing sonically that the Aeon 2 does better. I could tell you about all the other cheaper options that do some things better than the Aeon 2. For example, the Phoenix has deeper, more emphasized bass, more clarity, and greater treble extension. The M1570 is smoother from start to finish. The bass is slightly more emphasized than on the Aeon. The treble extension is noticeably greater, clearer, and more detailed on the 1570. The Aventone planar is downright neutral almost across the board compared to the Aeon 2. Its bass is about as rolled off as on the Aeon 2, but in all other respects, the planar is more faithful to the original recordings. The HD6XX and 660S have thicker bass response vocals that have more presence, thickness, naturalness than the Aeon 2. But these are all descriptions of different sound signatures, not overall better performance. And that's just the point. When you're up in the clouds, as the Aeon 2's price puts it, then it is really easy to find cheaper alternatives that might appear better for one reason or another. But standing alone, I cannot fault the Aeon 2 for anything. It's a fairly unique sound signature. It will not be to everyone's liking, however. The Aeon 2's price point will quickly take this out of most people's minds. But those who are willing to pay what the Aeon 2 costs, what's the analysis? This brings me to value. Well, I think you can argue that the Aeon 2 shows value to some people. Dan Clark did not market the Aeon 2 as groundbreaking. Their marketing seems limited to comparing the Aeon 2's performance with the last iteration of the headphone, and I think that's completely appropriate. Other headphone companies cannot stop themselves from making boastful comments regarding how wonderful, amazing, supreme their headphones are. They make promises that sound ridiculous, and in almost every occurrence turns out to be ridiculous. But since Dan Clark did not pull the audeze maneuver, I cannot hold Dan Clark responsible for any misstatements or false marketing. I recall my utter distaste for the original Aeon. Although I do not remember the sound at this point, I do remember how it made me feel. Without doubt, the Aeon 2 does not evoke any of those nasty feelings. The Aeon 2 is a very pleasant sounding headphone, at least in my very personal opinion. Whether you find it pleasant is questionable. Now look, I think Dan Clark is short-selling to you on a number of accounts. For example, the use of synthetic leather instead of real leather at $900 is a pretty lame and inexcusable choice. When we pay nearly $1,000 for products, every aspect should be premium. Furthermore, the ear pads are proprietary. They are glued on with tape. You can certainly pull them off without damaging the headphone, but because of the unique shape of these headphones, you can only buy replacement ear pads through Dan Clark. Comfort is still not quite there, at least I don't think so. The clamping force needs to be reduced a little bit more. It's not terrible, but I can say that after about 3 hours, I need to take off these headphones because of that pressure. The use of the mini XLR cable is frustrating. It's just more cost for the end user should the end user need to replace the cable. On the one hand, the cable feels and looks sturdy, so I cannot imagine this will be an immediate expense. However, if you intend to use balanced sources, then that cost will be an issue. The portability angle is once again overplayed. I was not impressed with the LCD-1's stupid folding gimmick, and I am not impressed with the Aeon 2's either. One thing that the Aeon 2 has going for it over the LCD-2, however, is the build. At least you can throw the Aeon 2 in your bag and not worry about crushing the ear cups. The LCD-1, in all of its plastic glory, is a fragile headphone. My position is that there are more positives about the Aeon 2 than there are negatives, and even the negatives are not that offensive in the grand scheme. But $900 is a lot of money to demand, and I really do not see how Dan Clark can justify this price. Frankly, nobody asked them to use titanium or add a folding mechanism, but they chose to do it, and that resulted in a questionable benefit at the cost of, well, more cost. For less money, you can get similar sound, or a sound signature that better suits your preferences. At $900, I think the Aeon 2 is a tough sell. Now, there's nothing wrong with the headphone. It works and sounds quite pleasantly. Indeed, I can see a lot of people quite happy with this headphone. So, my overall conclusion is that the Aeon 2 is value only if you're absolutely certain this is the sound you want. For everyone who is budget conscious, I think you get more for less money in the headphones I mentioned several minutes ago.